A surprise hit for 2026, Crimson Desert is turning heads for pushing some of the more impressive open-world visuals this generation. On a tech level at least, it's got some highlights. Every city, hilltop and valley is alive with bustle, from the wildlife to the roaming townsfolk to the guards on sentry duty. It's a heavily systems-based game too, leading to all manner of emergent moments as you toy with the NPCs who at times are even at odds with one another. Paired with its ray tracing support and an open world design packed with dense vegetation, it coalesces into a vividly realized fantasy package. And what's more, there's no Unreal Engine 5 in sight. Rather, developer Pearl Abyss returns to its in-house Black Space engine to do the heavy lifting on PC, PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series consoles. Before you dive in though, there are a few nitpicks, some points of friction that are worth underlining. First up, be prepared to learn Crimson Desert's unusual, often convoluted controls. Especially in its Breath of the Wild-esque puzzle bits, these involve multiple button combinations to access abilities. Once you know how they work, it's fine, but there's a real learning curve here, and the instructions aren't always terribly clear. On top of this, actual response times to your controller input have a weighty feeling, especially on the 30 FPS modes on console. Chiefly, this is owed to the game's heavy animation priority, notably in combat, which means there's a mushy delayed reaction after each button press for attacking, dodging, or jumping. A shame considering there are actual platforming segments to get through. And finally, there are the loading screens. This again works in a pretty bizarre way, with a loading screen opening to a cave area, after which Cliff walks forward for a good while, before emerging to the actual save point you selected. I'm glad to say, Crimson Desert's high points visually tend to eclipse these strange design choices. All of this applies to both base PS5 and PS5 Pro versions, and booting either reveals a suite of options in the game menus. You get 3 graphics modes on each, for 60 FPS performance, 40 FPS balanced, and 30 FPS quality. On top of that, there's an option to toggle 120Hz support and also separately switch VSync on and off, which gives some flexibility for VRR displays. Curiously, the balanced mode works whether 120Hz is enabled or not, but to get a 40 FPS line you'll need that higher refresh. Otherwise, you'll just get 30 FPS out of this balanced mode on a 60Hz display, which is actually quite useful, as I'll get to later. Consider it a kind of 4th extra graphics mode. And there's one more thing, a 2GB patch released on March 29th, adding one more toggle for fixed 4K output, which aims to address complaints of base PS5's blurry image quality in its performance mode. More on this in just a moment. There's a lot to check out then, so I'm focusing on just the PlayStation 5 machines today, base and Pro, and then looping back to Xbox afterwards. So, what's the best way to play between all these modes on base PS5? What's the visual trade-off between them? And is the compromise to its 60 FPS performance mode settings too great? Secondly, what's the benefit for PS5 Pro users, where it's confirmed that Sony's new, improved PSSR is engaged alongside higher settings? Let's find out.
Recently, another open-world game also launched a desert version in March. That's Where Winds Meet, who are sponsoring this video. It's a free-to-play open-world action RPG set in 10th century China, and now the game is getting a massive content drop with the new 1.5 Li Angzhou update, bringing a whole host of new features and systems to the game. The centerpiece of the update is Li Angzhou itself, a massive new snow map that gives you plenty of sweeping atmospheric environments to explore. It's filled with hidden historical references and ancient architecture, alongside unique geographical details like flowing wine springs and jade pools. On the combat front, the update introduces the Hung Blade, a straight-bladed weapon recreating designs from the Tang Dynasty. The martial arts animations here were developed with choreography from action directors recognized by the Hong Kong Film Awards and Taiwan Golden Horse Awards. This feeds into a counter-after deflection mechanic designed to let you actively interrupt enemy attacks and trigger counterattacks. You'll put those mechanics to use against the update's 3 new world bosses and 2 new campaigns. These encounters are built around story-driven combat mechanics, music and cultural symbolism, with a narrative experience in Li Angzhou that focuses on the authentic stories of heroes and ordinary people after the Onlu Shan Rebellion. Where Winds Meet is available now on PC, PS5 and mobile, with Lee Ang-jo dropping April the 2nd. Click the link in the video description below to find out more.
Okay, comparisons first, and let's kick off with base PS5. As ever with these complex open world efforts like The Witcher 3 or Bethesda's works, there is a time of day system, plus weather variances out of my control. Volumetric clouds are even in play overhead, constantly changing the way sunlight scatters across the distant terrain. With that in mind, there are still some pretty clear differences between PS5's trio of modes. In fact, Pearl Abyss has kindly revealed every mode's native resolution, upscaling technique, and every visual setting in one big blowout. In this business, it's a very rare luxury to have all these details presented up front. It's also, I will admit, very detail dense, but here's everything you need to know at a glance about base PS5. By far, the biggest factor here is that top line, the resolution. First off, targeting 60 frames per second on base PS5's performance mode is no small feat, and to achieve it, that runs at just a native 1080p. Meanwhile, the balanced mode runs at a higher 1280p resolution with AMD's FSR 3 scaling to 4K, while the quality mode is a revelation at 1440p with that same FSR 3 method. Flipping between base PS5's performance and quality modes, the two extremes, image clarity is drastically improved on that latter option. It's a night and day difference. Fine, distant detail like foliage is done justice with a 1440p input, and in turn, FSR 3 gets plenty of pixel data to reconstruct a convincing 4K frame. Now, a huge issue with the performance mode is that, at Crimson Desert's launch on base PS5 anyway, it ran with no intelligent upscaler in place. FSR 3 was disabled for this mode. The engine rendered out a flat 1080p, including 1080p menus, with a rudimentary rough upscale to 4K from that point. Compared to the other modes, it didn't flatter Crimson Desert's detail-rich landscapes, and all that fine tree detail appeared blurred on 4K displays. As mentioned though, Pearl Abyss has attempted to address this with a March 29th patch. A fixed 4K output toggle is now included on base PS5 and PS5 Pro that effectively enables an AMD FSR 3 upscale to 4K on the performance mode. It still renders internally at 1080p, but with this 4K toggle enabled, it's using the same upscaler as base PS5's other two modes. In that sense, it really only has any impact on this 60fps option. And on PS5 Pro, where it's also included, there's zero impact thanks to PSSR being engaged as a 4K upscaler on all three of its own modes anyway. It's basically a none setting on PS5 Pro, but it has one use case for the base machine. Let's pit base PS5's performance mode against a playthrough with that fixed 4K output option engaged on top. The good news is that the entire frame is immediately sharpened up via that FSR 3 upscale to 4K. The HUD also renders at 4K this way as with base PS5's other two modes, and all round it's problem solved on the visual front. No question, it's a big improvement. The penalty to the game's frame rate though is considerable, and while the 60fps line on PS5's performance mode was far from locked beforehand, bolting on this FSR 3 upscale does it no favors. Where previously the game ran in the 50 to 60 FPS range, say in the Tinkerton area, this toggle now drops performance to the mid-40s. Frequently, this falls outside the ideal VRR window for PS5 systems too, going well under 48 FPS, which fundamentally makes the mode hard to recommend. Of course, all heavily CPU-bound areas that previously dropped to the 30 to 40 FPS range, like this Bug Hill area with multiple NPCs, run at a similar frame rate either way. But the fact is that with 4K output enabled, there's rarely any scenario where base PS5 hits 60 now. Offering players more options is a good thing, obviously, but there's a sense that Pearl Abyss has not made the effort to optimize for 60 on base PS5 at all here. Instead, we're lumbered with two less than ideal variations on this mode, one that runs at 30 to 60 FPS with poor image quality, and now another with cleaner visuals but even worse performance. Not great. So what about base PS5's other two modes, balanced and quality? Up front, these are genuinely better optimized for the hardware, with a few settings upgrades worth highlighting here. Switching to base PS5's 30 FPS quality mode, for example, qualifies you for a high preset for almost every setting across the board, whereas its performance mode settles for a hybrid of low, medium, and high. Sadly, no matter which mode you pick, foliage density always remains fixed at medium on base PS5, as does water quality. There's no difference in foliage draw distances as a result, while those waterfalls tend to look rather simplistic on every mode. Even so, the key boosts on PS5's quality mode are as follows: ray tracing quality, lighting, model quality, and post-processing. Of all these, the model quality upgrade is the most outstanding, with the boost to a high preset allows for vastly improved displacement mapping. Hence, looking at the ground here, the rocks and soil have greater 3D depth while flipping to and from base PS5's 30 FPS mode. Next along, lighting and ray tracing improvements have a subtle impact, but certainly visible if you know where to look. Dark, shaded areas like the undersides of bridges or corners of interiors receive extra bounce lighting on this quality mode via that high preset. It's a neat touch and clear to see on the undersides of the White Crow's hat too. And finally, the 30 FPS quality mode gets a high post-processing setting, adding tricks like bloom and lens flares from the sun. Regardless of your chosen mode, there are a few rough points on base PS5. Across this comparison, expect lots of shimmering across water bodies, while shadowing around interiors with a torch in hand creates these obvious blotchy artifacts across walls. Combined with that FSR3 upscaling method, even at 1440p, there's obvious ghosting at play as well. So it's a very mixed bag. The overwhelming verdict is that the quality mode, if you're able to stomach 30 FPS, presents the most ideal realization of Crimson Desert's world on base PS5. Even the balanced mode holds up well, I'd say, in image quality terms, and it keeps most of the quality mode's benefits in lighting, model quality, and post-processing. The spread of settings for base PS5's modes scale as you'd expect, but what do PS5 Pro users get? Flipping over to every Pro setting at a glance, all three of its modes take a relative leap forward. There's a few key highlights here. Firstly, PS5 Pro's 60 FPS performance mode is close to the settings of base PS5's quality mode. It gets almost high presets across the board, with the exception being that it drops model quality and post-processing back to medium. You still get that 3D displacement mapping and lens flares at least, so no matter which mode you pick on PS5 Pro, you get those as a bare minimum. Alas, foliage and water quality are fixed at medium on every mode once again, while shadow quality is locked at high across the board, much like base PS5 on all its own modes. On the plus side, PS5 Pro's big flourish is its push to some ultra settings for the balanced and quality modes, with the latter enjoying ultra ray tracing and lighting quality to sweeten the deal. In practice though, taking the best case 30 FPS quality mode on base PS5 and then comparing that to PS5 Pro's own 30 FPS mode, there are diminishing returns on what those top settings actually add. Flipping between them, you get visible improvements to lighting. Distant rock formations are better defined with shading filling each crevice, but those changes in ray tracing and model quality are much more subtle. The biggest twist for PS5 Pro is its higher native resolutions per mode, and the adoption of Sony's new PSSR as an upscaler. No need for FSR3 this time around. Specifically, we get a native 1080p on the performance mode and then 1440p on balanced, each using the new PSSR model to scale to 4K. Impressively, Pro's 30 FPS quality mode doesn't need any of this upscaling trickery at all. It's all rendering at a straight 3840 by 2160 from the get-go. Except you may have spotted that there's something amiss here, in that the higher pixel counts on Pro's balanced and quality modes do not translate to a sharper image. In fact, in a strange twist, the 60 FPS performance mode consistently produces a sharper image by comparison. Looking into this myself, the pixel counts are all 100% correct and match Pearl Abyss's resolution listings. It's 1080p, 1440p, and then 4K from left to right. The quality mode on the far right is genuinely rendering a 4K base image judged by the first frame after a camera cut, where the base pixel structure is left raw, and yet left to settle for a few frames. The image then softens on Pro's balanced and quality modes, leading to these results. So why is this happening? The gut reaction is that PSSR could be a factor on PS5 Pro here, except it's not even enabled on that quality mode, and it is on the 60fps performance mode, where there's no issue. The second theory is that the game's ultra post-processing setting adds a form of lens distortion. The settings sheet shows only the balanced and quality modes on Pro have this ultra-grade post-processing, which is a logical point of differentiation from Pro's much sharper performance mode. Whatever the case, it's a shame to see image clarity taking a hit on those higher fidelity modes. Even compared to base PS5's best quality mode, running at 1440p with an FSR 3 upscale to 4K, there's an obvious blurring to that distant detail, despite Pro pushing a true 4K image. Next up, let's properly dig into the topic of performance. To help summarize all of this quicker, I've crunched a lot of this data into a three-way split, kicking off with base PS5's 3 modes. For the best bid for 60fps, I've also kept that performance mode running without the taxing 4K output toggle. It just impacts frame rates too greatly, I think, even with that much improved image. Cutting to the chase then, the 60fps mode really demands a VRR display to enjoy in the smoothest, most judder-free manner, even without a FSR 3 upscale, and even in this best case, it's certainly not immune to drops. Running around this opening town area, the range is typically 45 to 60 FPS, with big clusters of NPCs tending to be the culprit for drops. Beyond busy town areas, the reading is generally much better and tighter in its lock at the target 60. So some puzzle dungeons and barren valleys are usually fine. On the flip side, within the first hour, you'll be exploring basic areas like sewers or going to taverns packed with NPCs. And here, again, the reading tanks to the mid-40s. In short, there's simply no avoiding drops outside the ideal 48 to 60 VRR window on PS5, and going by this evidence, we're often hitting a CPU bottleneck. Now, long-time viewers of Digital Foundry will know I love a good stress test. Whether it's Blighttown in Dark Souls, The Witcher 3's infamous Crookback Bog, or Fallout 4's Corvega Factory, there's always an extreme case for finding the lowest lows in performance. For Crimson Desert, we might just have a new candidate, one that my good friend and colleague John Linneman has dubbed Bug Hill. This is right over on the east side of the map, and crucially cranks the on-screen enemy count to ludicrous numbers. Mechanical laser beam wielding creatures and soldiers duke it out for supremacy on this hilltop, and it's my job to carve out a route without getting hit. For base PS5 and PS5 Pro, as I'll get to, this is the point at which any hope for 60fps play is in tatters. In fact, all 3 modes push identical numbers at one stage here, synchronized by an apparent CPU bottleneck with a sub 30fps reading by the end. Simply put, the 60fps mode is aspirational at best. Sometimes it does hit the mark, but the reading plummets much too often to be tenable. It's impossible to ignore the drops on base PS5's other modes too, the 40fps and 30fps modes. Of the 3, the quality mode is arguably the more consistent, but even here we're faced with juddery sub-30 drops. These aren't limited to Bug Hill either. The quality mode is running in the mid-20s while swimming, where its 1440p resolution and higher ray tracing setting are in contention for bandwidth. The net result is the lowest reading of the 3, while the 40fps balanced option also struggles to hit its target at 35fps. An early battle sequence test also again reveals big issues in both modes, handling of multiple NPCs. So again, it's high 20s on the quality mode and mid 30s on the balanced option. Not ideal, and the reality is that no mode is properly optimized to their target on base PS5. There is an interesting workaround though. My preferred way to play Crimson Desert on base PS5 is to use the balanced mode, albeit with 60Hz as the console output. You get all the very same settings as at 120Hz, including that 1280p native resolution with FSR 3 upscaling, but this setup locks at 30fps instead. The key benefit is it locks at 30 more consistently, and that lower ceiling effectively disguises the drops we'd otherwise see on a 40fps cap. Personally, this is my pick for base PS5, though there's one other potential way forward here. Disabling VSync in the menus while using the 60fps option with 120Hz selected opens up the widest range for performance for VRR displays. Looking up to the sky even has us glancing the 100fps line, while more typical gameplay has that figure lurk in the 65 to 70fps range. We can't get carried away here, of course, because all the usual CPU bottlenecks apply in Bug Hill or busy city centers where it still drops to 30fps. It doesn't solve that problem, and image quality remains pretty poor. Still, this setup does see base PS5 spitting out as many frames as it possibly can, with some benefit in fluidity for VRR displays. Finally, let's swap over to PS5 Pro. The bottom line is that the Pro's more powerful GPU makes the 40fps balanced mode the best pick overall. In most scenarios, whether that's the town run or even battling enemy hordes in woodlands, that 40fps lock is just much tighter than the 30fps or 60fps alternatives. Unfortunately, the native 4K rendering and ultra ray tracing settings of Pro's quality mode strain it to a point that it often loses grip on its 30fps target. Once again, interactions with water are a major pitfall for this specific mode, just as with base PS5, and those mid-20s readings make this one to avoid. On the other hand, PS5 Pro's 60fps mode is better on average compared to base PS5's own equivalent option. Putting this in a direct comparison between the two machines, there's up to a 10fps improvement on PS5 Pro, where CPU limits aren't a concern anyway. VRR is much more viable on this mode on PS5 Pro then, with so many of these areas running at a more palatable 50 to 60fps. Then again, of course, those CPU taxing scenes on Bug Hill put us at a nadir of 30fps on Pro, just as with the base machine, so there's limited gains in these moments. The good news for PS5 Pro then is that there's enough headroom for Perlibis to recommend both the performance and balanced modes by disabling VSync on a 120Hz screen. This way, you extract the most frames from any given scene. So for example, the performance mode runs at up to 105fps on Pro and settles in gameplay in the mid-60s. Plenty of frame data for VRR to work with then, and then its balanced mode is more ambitious with that native 1440p image, which puts us more typically in the mid-50s. Again, absolutely viable for VRR to work, Bug Hill notwithstanding. All round then, the optimization effort on PS5 Pro doesn't get any sort of glowing review here, but you do at least get some more appealing options. Between all of Crimson Desert's modes and toggles, there's a route to getting some great results on PS5 Pro at least. The sheer spectacle of its visuals is left intact, while Pro's frame rates are more stable across the board, especially if you settle for a 40fps middle ground. The same, however, cannot be said for base PS5. Between all the base consoles modes and its new 4K output option, I was constantly facing some unwanted drawback or another. There are just so many permutations to tinker with here, including that 120Hz option and the VSync toggle. In the end, there's no perfect single option to use on base PS5, and Perlibis has seemingly dodged the responsibility of actually optimizing the game under the guise of presenting all these options. All of which is a shame, because on a tech level, there's some genuinely great stuff to check out here. It's a full-blooded current-gen effort, and one that's also built on unique engine technology for a change, always a thing to celebrate. That's all from me today though, and of course I'll be looping back with Xbox coverage in due course. If you did like this video in any way, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To support what we do at Digital Foundry, check out our Patreon, and to get in touch directly, you know where to find us. But for now, thanks for watching.